Good morning, good afternoon. It's great to have you here with us. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today for our masterclass, The Do's and Don'ts of Digital Workspace Transformation. Today, we are joined by Michael Schuster, CEO of Ferroque Systems, Kevin Nardone, Director of Customer Success at Citrix Systems, Todd Shu, President at Ferroque Systems, and myself. Hi, everybody. I'm Amber. I look after the marketing here at Ferroque. Michael is the CEO of Ferroque Systems and highly recognized Citrix consulting partner in North America, serving the role of an architect. Michael has sat on Citrix's consulting team for over half a decade and has led many of Citrix's most significant consulting engagements. He regularly contributes to Citrix's leading practices and documentation. Kevin Nardone is the Director of Customer Success for Citrix Americas, bringing over 10 years of end-user computing experience across some of the largest and most technically complex customers in the Citrix ecosystem. Kevin is also one of Citrix's leading Azure subject matter experts, delivering several webinars, Citrix Synergy, Summit presentation, and blogs in collaboration with Microsoft for the Citrix Technology and Practices web series. And Todd is one of the earliest pioneers of Citrix solutions in North America, who built one of the most successful Citrix practices in the world. His business was acquired by Citrix in 2012, after which Todd led Citrix's consulting organization in Canada for 5 years. Today, Todd joins Ferroque as both president and partner. Hello, gentlemen. Thanks for being with us today.
Good afternoon, good morning. Thanks for having me here.
People have always worked remote. It was just a very small number of people in the past, and it came with a whole lot of complications. Over the years, as technology has improved, more and more people have enjoyed the benefits and the headaches of working remote. It started off with a brick of a phone, the pager, the laptop, and then the highly mobile phone. Today, people carry their laptops and tablets with them everywhere they go. They schedule calls on their commute, and when they're walking their dog, they take a call from their watch. COVID has only accelerated the remote work revolution, not initiated it. However, today, companies must now compete in this new digital workspace. I have seen a game development company transition nearly 100 staff from an office environment to a work from home environment in a matter of days. This type of transition was required due to COVID restrictions. However, so many other factors play a key role in the success of this transition, such as security, end user experience, ability to remain effective and efficient in their day-to-day tasks. And I can tell you, after COVID restrictions are over, the hybrid, or what we like to call the fusion workspace, will remain. So many companies have had to make these types of transitions, not necessarily due to COVID, but to stay competitive in the marketplace, to save costs, and to innovate. Today, teams work from home, the office, the Ferroque Lamborghini, and even Grandma's house. Mergers and acquisitions may require the need for digital workspace transformation. So might the need to remain competitive due to talent retention. Data breach and security is a massive concern for so many people accessing networks via VPNs, hotspots, and public free Wi-Fi. There are many reasons for digital workspace transformation. Today, we'll start off by defining what success should look like. We'll go over an engagement strategy and some reasons for failure. We'll review Kotter's 8 steps to success, review the do's and don'ts of digital transformation, and identify some key takeaways. So if you have questions, please join us, add them to the chat, hold them to the end. We would love to answer them and engage you in this presentation.
So Amber, first of all, thank you. That was an awesome overview and a really great introduction to the subject of what we're doing today, which is really talking about digital transformation, specifically on the user's workspace. And one of the most important things that we started to touch on is really starting down the path of identifying an organization's motivations. Why are they looking to engage in a digital transformation on the workspace, whether it's an evolution of their existing digital workspace strategy or just a dramatic shift in their endpoints? And understanding these motivations will start to reveal a number of key requirements and drivers that we can then work towards as we're going through discovery, as we're going through designs, and how we adjust and plan our rollouts with the goal in mind of maximizing effectiveness and reducing challenges with adoption and satisfaction amongst the end user community. And to start off with, this can be a common driver, let's say motivation-wise, is going to be, let's say COVID, which is a more prevalent example right now. Again, the workspace transformation is something that's been happening for a number of organizations over the past 10 plus years, but it's really ramped up over the course of the pandemic, as Amber mentioned too. A lot of customers have been revisiting their workspace deployment and how it runs and delivered to end users because of how the shift to SaaS applications have impacted things. They don't need as many applications running and to be managed on a bunch of local endpoints. They can leverage SaaS applications to better deliver applications to their end users and therefore reduce some of the power requirements on their endpoints as well. So that's come up with this bit of an advent of the modern workspace. Has also been dubbed as well. Another key motivation we see a lot is, and this can be either in relation to existing work modalities or just simply existing work styles for remote workers, such as a VPN, where we're working to improve upon legacy architectures like the use of client VPNs to better protect corporate assets and corporate data from data exfiltration, hackers getting into the environment and whatnot, and providing better means to secure our intellectual property through technologies such as Citrix, for example, which can pretty much act as a presentation layer with a lot of high level and low level security controls, can help mitigate risks associated with ingress access to the network or intellectual property being stolen or data exfiltration. Another common motivation that we come across very often would be, as an example, mergers and acquisitions. The ability to rapidly roll out a workspace to new employees or employees of an existing company that's being acquired can be exceptionally powerful as far as being able to accomplish organizational goals rapidly. I'm aware of a number of insurance companies, for example, whose business model across North America is centered on mergers and acquisition. Well, they'll absorb up to 80 to 100 different insurance companies over the course of any given year, with hundreds of employees, thousands of employees across each year as they grow. And they only can do this that fast by being able to provide their employees with BYOD devices, or maybe the existing corporate access from the other company, a digital workspace. And they're able to turn it on like that, scale it out in a cloud or on premise, whatever the case may be, and provide rapid access to these things, which gives them a much more competitive advantage and the ability to work far more efficiently than running around investing hundreds of thousands of dollars for large acquisitions to roll out new laptops, shipping them out to people, blah, 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 blah. You understand where I'm going. The remote work revolution, again, providing organizations the flexibility to have employees and contractors, whatever the case may be, vendors, working from outside the corporate walls, maybe in other corporate offices, or just due to work styles, they need to be able to work from multiple different areas with a high level of fluidity to meet people's personal preferences or the requirements of their jobs to begin with. And that's been a large driver for customers needing to revisit how they get apps and desktops and data to their employees as well. Global connection, teams being spread out. Another example of that, which we just touched on with the remote work to a degree, but also just the fact that a lot of customers now, and companies rather, are understanding that with the way that we're all connected and the online and the prevalence of high-speed internet and the ability to we can now focus on gaining talent across the globe, not necessarily as historically used to be whoever was in proximity to our headquarters or who was willing to move into the geo where we had offices. And that allows us to hire for talent, and that means providing the right work environment and tools for that talent to work most effectively while also being secure, enabling them to do their best work no matter where they're at. So that's another piece thing as well. It ties into talent retention. Again, when customers are very focused on, or organizations are very focused on working within the corporate office, and it starts to impact people's work styles, or now, as we understand, there's been some trends in the resignation trends over the course of the pandemic, where people are now looking elsewhere to find more flexible work opportunities with other employers. And being able to retain talent by being able to adapt to their personal preferences and work modalities and what they need to balance work and life has also become important, which has also required organizations to revise the components of their digital workspace, thus a transformation. Critical business events can come into this as well. Has there been an event like a catastrophe or a massive ransomware hack that's taken out the company that requires us to pivot rapidly and get the business back online when tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars are being lost by the day when that company's offline? So that's required customers to pivot as well and either roll out temporary remote work strategies or make a dramatic shift to implement new remote work strategies to accommodate for major events that have impacted the business, whether it's security related or natural disaster or what have you. And migration, still even in this day and age, companies change head offices, they change regions, they're opening up new offices, they're moving users between different countries or whatnot, and be able to have a more adaptable digital workspace versus maybe a more traditional model has increasingly become important. So these are certainly not a comprehensive list, but it's just a high level list of some common motivators that we see for why customers try and revise, revisit, and reinvent their work strategy and their workspace strategy. And we'll start talking about discovery. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague here, Kevin Nardone, to drive us through a couple of key items there.
No, thank you, Michael. And especially when you think of discovery, it's like, it really comes down to like asking the right questions. Like, why is the business going through this process? And especially when you think of a lot of the motivations that Michael, that you just hit on before, it's really like oftentimes about adding resiliency, right? Like, what are we trying to do to make the business more like ability to kind of handle net new risk or unforeseen risk? So thinking, for example, of like, hey, reducing operating costs. Like, you know what, we need to invest in another area that's higher margins for our business. Like, what we need to do is kind of, compress or adjust how we're delivering this technology to the market to be more competitive. Or, for example, to invest in our people or invest in new ways to provide experiences to our customers. Business agility, again, like I mentioned, is often about resiliency to get into new markets, resiliency to react to change in capacity, change in demand, change in seasonality. I mean, you see a lot of like cloud transformation projects today being pushed by business agility to accommodate that, that seasonality that some industries may have, like the travel industry with the pandemic, for example. Their demand completely collapsed, and now there's a lot of infrastructure, for example, that was sitting on the shelves not being used. Hey, you know what? We want to be able to use Azure or use GCP or AWS to spin up servers up and down, so we're not carrying that liability during our off-peak season. Then you also get things like security posture. What does that mean from a business standpoint? If you have a data breach, there's, an immediate brand recognition problem. I know Robinhood just had a data breach, for example, like years ago, like when Target had their data breach, I was a Target customer. I considered getting rid of my red card at that point. So there is a brand impact when you have those issues, as well as a compliance impact. Like HIPAA violations have a pretty serious fine associated with it. Why are we increasing the security posture? What risks are we trying to mitigate? And then you get into like supporting, remote or hybrid work. Oftentimes from a business standpoint, now it's about maintaining talent and being competitive. If you kind of just think of like kind of the great resignation that's kind of occurring in like the Americas labor market right now, people want that flexibility. People want to work hybrid. I know, for example, a few of my friends who do like inside sales within a few financial organizations, they did a survey that was pretty much, if we bring you back to the office, are you going to stay? And like a good majority was like, no, we'll quit. Like, so a lot of folks are really kind of wanting to, now they have the flexibility to potentially get opportunities in other areas. Supporting hybrid work isn't just like a necessity when it comes to maintaining business operations. It's eventually going to become a necessity for talent. So like creating KPIs in that area around, for example, like, okay, are we seeing churn within our employee base? Like, what's our employee satisfaction score? We want to improve employee work-life balance. Supporting a hybrid work program may have other drivers that sit outside of just risk mitigation to like unforeseen issues or office events, like in the weather, hey, you can't come in the office. So that's something that's starting to expand into the marketplace. So like understanding why you're here, it then gets into like, what are you trying to solve? Like, what are the pain points? What are the gaps that prevent us, whether it be technically, people, process, or technology, that prevent us from accomplishing these business goals? So for example, looking at, business agility, oftentimes it's like tech debt. And we have these legacy solutions, we've lost we've lost key knowledge points around our applications. We're unable to update it. We have more projects than people. We're unable to even get things off the ground, to be more agile. So for us to get rid of this tech debt, let's invest so that we can make more usage out of our knowledge capital that we have internally, consume more as a service so that our people that are in the IT space within our organization are focusing more on what drives the business rather than having to be an expert on a given set of solutions. And that's kind of what's probably driving a trend in as a service, as well as using managed service providers, especially in larger enterprises. The next piece as well, you have your business driver, you have your pain points, but understanding and identifying the vested interests of other key stakeholders, it's a great way to also potentially mitigate risk in your project. Oftentimes I see too many issues where hey, we're going to do this workspace strategy. We want to drive business agility. And then next thing you know, there's an application or a key dependency that was missed. And hey, we need you all to potentially adjust some firewall rules because you're blocking our ability to even communicate with this cloud service. Hey, sorry, that's, not a priority for us. We're in the middle of a change freeze. And you know what, we don't have the personnel to kind of go through our change control process. You're out of luck. And I've been on projects where certain key stakeholders of other departments that, someone's workspace strategy had dependencies on were unaware of the project. So having that team asking for help was an uphill battle in certain scenarios. So understanding, especially as part of your transformation, what are those constraints you need to work through? Who are the people that are engaged? And then also understand, how does this project accomplish their business goals when it comes to the IT strategy they might have within their department? And then when it gets into going through that process, what are the constraints? Are we going to drive this initial milestone in public cloud only? Do we already have, for example, an existing contract with Amazon? Hey, we might run into, licensing considerations on the Microsoft side, but we already have a landing zone for workloads for AWS. Based on our timelines, we can move faster. Let's now work and design around that constraint, but maybe potentially plan for adaptation in whether it be in your image management strategy, et cetera. What are other constraints? Like I mentioned, especially with cloud projects, resources that need to stay on premises. We have an application, it's, our EMR, we can't move this to the cloud, especially in a quick fashion, but you know what? There are other use cases that we can move faster. So identifying constraints also creates opportunity to increment in smaller chunks. Let's not focus on the use case to drive business agility that maybe 90% of the business runs on, because that's a huge lift, when there's a 10% that we can get a quick win because the team is still trying to figure out Azure AWS. Let's not deal with a people and process problem because that technology is new to the business, and introduce technology challenges on top of that by trying to move the hardest, most business critical application as your first project out of the gate. I've seen many projects fail with that, trying to do too much at once, not segmenting out. Let's see what those constraints are so you can then potentially navigate where the quick wins are. And then the last piece is really, what are the requirements for end state? Is end state, is success seen as complete transformative change, or is success seen as moving one use case at a time, or potentially, reducing a certain number of servers? What are the KPIs of success? Are they measurable? Are they measurable in an easy way? And how do we need to communicate them to the business, especially when it comes to addressing risk in some of the main areas I mentioned before? And that gets into defining success. After you go through this discovery internally with your peers, with your colleagues, it now gets into what does success look like as you go through this transformation? So thinking of a key project milestone, what's measurable? What factors do we want to measure internally, whether it be certain technology KPIs, for instance, hey, we need to reduce CapEx. The way we're going to measure that is let's, reduce the number of servers in our data center. We have our VDI initiative. VDI is expensive. It's persistent. We want to move to a non-persistent fashion to reduce the total cost of ownership, use more dynamic workloads and reduce CapEx and increase business agility, because we can't update 6,000 machines to respond to a security event, in say a Windows patch, without an entire elite task force of people having to suddenly update thousands of machines urgently rather than just doing a single image. What does success look like to drive that? Let's set a KPI again. That's your baseline, that's measurable, and incentivize your team to drive it. One of the most successful cloud transformations I've ever seen was a manufacturer in Europe that adapted like, Citrix to Cloud and Azure like years ago, back in like 2016. They actually, as part of this cloud transformation, they actually established a simple KPI that they can measure each team against. Have you moved what's the number of servers that you've moved into Azure? And then they established those initial use cases that they wanted to move, like general purpose apps, SAP, Office. And then they compensated those direct teams based on the numbers of servers they retired. And then they balanced that off based on like any like increase in tickets. So it wasn't just, hey, you're going to just throw as many servers as quickly as you can because people respond to incentives. They also like guardrailed that. Like, let's do it in a way where we're moving, but then the user experience isn't suffering on top of it. And they ended up establishing the baseline. Okay, this is our baseline ticket count for this given workload. Here's the baseline number of servers. Now, as you start moving that over, perfect. We're tracking X number of servers we got in Azure, and our baseline in terms of user experience hasn't changed. And Michael's going to take us through a few things too when it comes to end user engagement later. Part of this from there again gets into buy-in. Like, do these KPIs actually define success, especially when it comes to the end user community as well? Thinking of like a KPI from an end user standpoint, I might say like logon times. Logon times is often an area of optimization for user experience. That might mean something to, a Citrix admin or like the person who owns that infrastructure, but to an end user, that could be completely different. I think one of the most unique areas I've seen, through an end user interview is like really finding out that, hey, this end user community and call center, logon times matter to them because it would actually directly negatively impact their KPIs around like on-time starts. This one, food distributor, compensated and KPI their call center around like starting their shift on time as well as number of calls. Now, as part of their workflow, they would have to, log into Citrix for the first time, and that's how they would start their day. So like logon times, it was like an area of interest for this customer, but it wasn't something that was truly a focus area until we understood that long logon times were actually negatively impacting, that call center leader's KPIs around on-time starts for their employees. So that ended up kind of reshifting focus, got more buy-in, and then also kind of updated the project and added some baselines. So that way we can, hey, let's pivot prioritization and let's like focus on the call center first because there's some real pain here. A next thing too, especially when it comes into like going through that process, conducting workshops and go through data gathering. Doing something like, Microsoft has within the cloud adoption framework, and I love their methodology, digital estate planning. If we're going to do a transformative exercise, like I mentioned before in the discovery process, let's find a use case that is less constraints, easier. It gives the team an opportunity in a lower risk setting to get the process down and get the skill set down as you look towards new technologies that might be unfamiliar. So going through and identifying your persona and then rationalizing their digital estate. One, you're not rationalizing your whole business, which could be its own project in itself. You're rationalizing a small increment. And that also then gives you conversation topics to have when you sit down with those personas and gather feedback. There are a lot of tools that are available, especially when it comes to like assessing workloads, from Director, like within Citrix, you can pull performance utilization data. You can go into the capacity management trend reports to see what applications are actually being used. Oftentimes for customers that are going through like a workspace transformation and kind of changing their desktop model, say maybe to more apps or like non-persistent, if you're using things like SCCM, okay, what are the apps that we're most commonly deploying and what people are requesting through, say, our app store within SCCM? Let's create like a general purpose tool and capture like the top 20, and then let's establish a general purpose desktop and then work with some of our initial champions to kind of build that initial tiered service model. And that really comes through like, again, end user engagement. And then the next piece, and really like the final piece, it's a little bit obvious, is like building a project plan with that's roadmap based, not just, hey, we need to get to Azure. What's your release cycle as like an IT team? Like really thinking like agilely, hey, we're going to establish the landing zone. Next thing we're going to do is like, let's focus on doing like an initial use case and completing a pilot. We're going to then we're going to start rolling in newer technologies like workspace environment management, analytics, data after we've done the core of what we know. And like, let's establish a service roadmap with milestones through it as you go through that transformation. Again, so it's more incremental rather than like a big bang approach. Because especially with cloud, the pace of innovation is faster, the flexibility, the ability to adapt to change is faster. Having a project that's a little bit more incremental, you can use that change, the dynamic motion of just transformation within like a SaaS solution to like increment improvement over time. And that'll also build more, build more feedback, more momentum internally, build confidence, like help people be able to learn without suddenly kind of creating a lot of pressure and injecting risk that doesn't need to be there. Let's walk through like an example of, something Michael and I did with one of our customers who had an Azure project, and they wanted to really kind of change how they deliver BDI. So one of the first things we did is we kind of really sat down and tried to understand what are the three main business priorities and business outcomes they're trying to bring through this initiative. Now, reducing CapEx was a big one. They had a large hardware refresh. They really wanted to get out of the data center business. They were tired of purchasing these assets that need to be maintained. There's cost associated, power, cooling. They need to be racked and stacked, updated from a firmware standpoint. One as well, we rather shift that to OpEx. So there's like financial motivations as well. So for there, the plan to execute on that was really to migrate maximum possible hardware to the cloud, and they were going to do this through Azure. Now, cloud technology and like especially Azure, it wasn't just to reduce CapEx. They also saw it as a way to get into new markets and make their business much more resilient. Changes in demand, changes in market forces such as the pandemic. Hey, I can now have people work from home, or I don't need to ship laptops out to some of our contractors. They really wanted to kind of make their infrastructure more extensible and give their team the ability to react to change faster, especially when it comes to being competitive, getting access to the right talent, or staying ahead of like the latest security threat. And a lot of this was, looking at like flexible deployment, like what can we do to kind of shift more to as a service, so that way we can start looking at, we know our business more. We'd rather know our business rather than have to worry about maintaining technology. So this was done by like looking towards consolidating their Citrix environments and also creating more of a hybrid cloud orchestration through Citrix of their on-prem and Azure resources using Citrix Cloud. And then as part of this process, especially from an end user experience standpoint, we wanted to improve end user experience by simplifying their technology stack. And this kind of really came from like, let's take a look at the workload. Let's take a look at how you're delivering these persistent VDI and these laptops. And like, let's understand what people actually need. Let's rationalize, let's simplify the agents, simplify the apps, and like build a new process so that way you can create a tiered service model so your cloud resources are more cost efficient, which then can drive more scalability and growth because you can invest in a way that doesn't blow out your margins or your cost projections for the project. After we kind of got a good level set in terms of like what the motivation was, we then went through the discovery process and really tied each of these areas to what's the current state, what are the pain points of the current state, and how does it map back to that business outcome, that business need, and what are the near-term goals for their organization to address that business problem. So looking at current state, their VDI was on-prem today, traditional Citrix deployment, they only had a small cloud presence in Azure today. Nothing, this would be the first substantial workload. And one of the risks is that the team was new to Azure. This is their first time going a large scale project. How do we make sure we design it properly? How do we make sure we operate it properly? So that kind of really said like, hey, let's start with something that's going to be a quick win. Let's not try to take, this monolithic application that's, custom developed and there's limited tools or knowledge within the organization. We were saying like, what? This is new. Like, let's just do a general purpose Office desktop, Office 365, collaboration tools, etc., and then move it to non-persistent. And we ended up kind of backing that up with some of the SCCM distribution data they had within their systems to really show that that's mostly what people needed versus some of the line of business applications that was a smaller subset of the user community. And then we really set like KPIs to measure this. Okay, perfect. We're sunsetting VDIs on-prem. We're retiring some of these servers or repurposing them within our data center. And from there, like thinking long-term, taking that blueprint, that snapshot of what they're putting together in Azure, they can then use that to expand globally, especially when it comes to configuring that infrastructure and taking more of like an infrastructure as code concept, which is one of the key advantages of public cloud. From there, we also broke down like what's the current state and impact that, what they want to focus on to increase business agility. Right now, persistent VDI, hard to maintain, a lot of different, collaboration tools, for example, that became cumbersome for end users to understand and onboard new employees. Hey, welcome, you're a contractor, you're an employee. You have 3 collaboration tools you need to deal with. Good luck in finding out which ones, people use most often. So through that, they wanted to kind of address those pain points, kind of build out, layered methodology, kind of so they can push out, more dynamic apps, et cetera, as well as kind of shift and consolidate some of their collaboration tools, which then also drove down into their simplifying the technology stack. They're using multiple MFA options, like, hey, let's move towards SAML. Let's do a rationalization with our security team. Hey, we purchased this tool to address this specific issue. Oh, by the way, we own this tool that does the same thing maybe we can consolidate to kind of save some costs and also reduce some of the risk in terms of which tool broke what. We have to troubleshoot 4 different ones instead of like 1 or 2. And that also kind of drove, us to, from this conversation too, especially in discovery, we end up building like a roadmap for them. So kind of building into like, what's the motivations? Let's do discovery. And now how are we going to get to this solution? What is the roadmap? What are some, small chunks of activities? So that way we can kind of phase in innovation, kind of phase in progress. So we end up building a roadmap for them, which is on the next slide. There you go, perfect. So like, hey, let's do some core preparation. Again, thinking that like, Azure was new, we got to do some additional data gathering. How are we doing chargeback? What's the digital estate of that initial persona that we're going to target? What are the VM sizes? Let's not take, again, what you're doing on-prem and just push it in cloud. What do people actually need? And we can always adjust accordingly because the infrastructure is more agile. Let's get the cloud licensing we need, and let's start preparing the team with education. And then once we're ready and we're up-leveled from a skill set standpoint, let's now actually go about doing the design of what we need to do. Perfect. Milestone achieved. We've trained the team and we've defined that service tier, and we've gotten the business on board in terms of changing and how we're going to address and communicate that change to our end users. Now let's design and build out the plan. We have the employee engagement strategy defined, the user groups that we're going to target for the pilot, and we know and we've documented the image onboarding process. Perfect. We've hit those milestones. Now let's actually start the migration process. And let's go about building what we need to do to drive that transformation strategy, to reduce CapEx, increase our business agility, and simplify the technology stack. And now let's actually execute it. Let's put hands on keyboard and start building. Because we've prepared, we're skilled, we've up-leveled, and we've seen where our operations need to change. We're building off a consistent plan that's flexible and modular. And now let's start migrating. And then building off of that modular design, we can then now address future opportunities. So like adding different types of VDI, moving towards like what they call like next gen authentication with biometrics, shifting to an infrastructure as a code model, working with their security team and consolidating functions, and then transitioning point solutions such as the way they use F5 to Citrix ADC again to reduce the number of vendors that they were working with. So we kind of followed that like Michael started out with, what's your motivations? Let's get everyone on board for these motivations. And then we did proper discovery when it comes to getting everyone aligned. How are we measuring progress against these business outcomes? And then built an incremental roadmap to drive forward. And now one of the things too, especially for this project, and Michael's going to get into it in a couple minutes, is like we were changing fundamentally how some of these users were going to work. They're very much used to just installing an application. I'm going to kind of move forward with a desktop. Now, if you go to non-persistent, that's changing. That's going to change how you interface with that, what your expectations are. And oftentimes in these transformative projects, there is often a very human element to this, right? You're changing how somebody works. You're changing how somebody integrates with technology. So making sure you have the right end user and employee engagement strategy as a part of that is definitely critical for transformation. So that actually brings us to the next conversation topic, Michael, is really around engaging that end user community and some of the strategy behind it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. So here's the thing with a digital workspace transformation. Digital transformation, depending on what we're doing, will affect users or it may not. A massive digital transformation for an organization, as an example, might be moving to cloud. Very common. It may not affect users that much. If we're going paperless, it may affect some of the user workflows. If a user spent the last 10 years plus working on physical endpoints or workstations in the office or laptops at home, and now we're going to roll out a VDI and they've really locked down their endpoint, or it's a VDI and they access everything from an iPad or a thin client or something like an iGel thin client or whatnot, you're shifting the way they're working quite a bit. You're opening great opportunities, but you're shifting how they're working, and that has a direct user impact. And one of the things I want to stress to folks here is user acceptance of what we're doing for the workspace will make or break the workspace transformation. But something that affects how users work, and again, the idea here usually with these engagements is to, and again, it depends on the priorities, but it's usually to improve the user experience, increase agility of the business, reduce operational costs, and improve our security posture in many cases. We need to make sure that we've got user buy-in along the way for that, or else we're going to start having detractors in the organization that is actually going to hamper this successful rollout of your transformation, or even just stop it in its tracks. So it's really important for that user acceptance and to get the users involved throughout the process. And this starts with clear communications from the outside of the engagement, staying engaged with the employees, letting them know what's going on, what the benefits are, why we're doing this, and how it affects not just the organization in positive manners, but also them. And the reason for this too is, to put it simply, a user is more likely to be receptive and go along with a change that might change their workflow or might require a little bit extra effort in some way. Let's say introducing multi-factor authentication for security. If they understand the implications of not doing this, if they understand the risk to the business of not doing this or how it protects them personally, it gives them a bit more of a vested interest to understand why, yeah, this is taking me a few extra seconds each day to do this one or two things to get my workday going, but I understand the outcomes and the benefits, and that far outweighs the minor inconvenience. And these, depending on the industry, these things become very important. I can tell you, working a lot with healthcare, Ferroque's worked with 30+ healthcare organizations across North America, including some of the largest in the world, that something as simple as moving an icon on a clinician's desktop can raise hell and service tickets. So understanding how users work and the criticality of them knowing where everything is, or how they work, and the importance of the way things are being the way they are, is really, really important. So being able to communicate effectively the changes that are going on, why, and the status of where things are at is going to be helpful in keeping the message out there and keeping people engaged and aware of what's going on. And also developing proper onboarding documentation and plans to get users involved earlier on and start getting used to the systems is very important. Because again, usually not all users are going to be asking for the changes you're introducing, but we need to make sure that how to get from A to B is very accessible to them. How do I access this new desktop if I was accessing my applications or whatnot in a different way before? What am I doing now that's different from connecting my VPN every day to accessing a Citrix URL to access my desktop, as an example? And this also ties into finding creative ways to engage users. So again, especially with the digital workspace transformation, or anything that has significant change to users' workflows, especially in companies and organizations that are very, very busy and very fast paced, users aren't always going to be reading their emails or watching the video links that you send them. We do it because we have to, and they are important, don't get me wrong, but not every employee or staff member is going to have the time to look at these assets. So working with one large healthcare organization in the US in the last few years, one thing we had developed with them was the idea of kiosks, where during lunch hours or break times in the cafeteria or other areas where doctors and clinicians and nurses were able to relax, we had these kiosks set up where they could go and start onboarding themselves on their own time to enroll in the new system, so that when it came time to cut over their region to this new workspace strategy, they could do so without suddenly a bombshell being dropped in them that they completely on day one have no idea how to get from A to B. They've already got some familiarity, they've already been enrolled, we've gotten ahead in the curve to make sure that we're reducing some of the risk that comes along with these workspace changes by finding creative solutions to help move the needle on adoption and preparedness. Another thing I really want to stress as well, and this happens through the discovery as well as the pilot programs, is interviewing users and business units for their feedback on, let's say, the development of a digital workspace strategy. Again, going back to that healthcare organization as an example, we developed a number of interview processes to interview each one of the regions of this healthcare organization to understand what applications they used, how they worked, the nature of their work, things of that nature and beyond, so we could understand what was critical to them. And we actually uncovered things, because we allowed us to get the hard data, not make assumptions about how they work, that allowed us to accommodate areas of their workspace and to accommodate their work styles. So when we rolled this out in pilot on day one, we did not start off on the wrong foot, and we're actually impacting them. So it's really important to have these feedback processes, which we'll talk about a little later, and these interview processes to gather data. So, and this also demonstrates to the end users that you really do care and you are taking them seriously, and what you're designing and developing is truly for their benefit. And that really helps the buy-in. People understand that you are listening to them. And another thing that goes along with that too is identifying champions within each of the business units. So these will likely also turn into some of your first pilot users, but developing a team of folks that are invested in the change, not just the stakeholders, but folks in the business units that are open-minded, invested in the change, understand the value of it, because when they're on your side, you're able to more effectively communicate the change and the positive benefits from it, moving to a different work style, new digital workspace strategy, whatever the case may be, in a way that will likely get other folks that might be indifferent or maybe less enthusiastic about the fact that we're forcing a work change on them to be a bit more receptive and be more open. And that can be very, very powerful. We see that all the time in different arenas, whether it's marketing or whether it's in politics or whatnot. The value of people advocating for changes and getting folks that are more like-minded than maybe the business decision makers higher up to understand that what the net benefits are and how it's helping the business, how it's going to help them work better and keep the organization more secure, as an example. Establishing pilot groups is also really important. And again, as I mentioned, this is largely going to tie into the champions, but also an extended group, because the pilot you want to staff pilot groups with people that are going to be relatively open-minded, not necessarily people that are going to be indifferent and detractors, where they're piloting the platform and they're running into a couple of issues. They're less likely to run out and start complaining to their colleagues about what a dumpster fire this has been so far. People that are open-minded to run the pilot and the UAT, to grab the feedback so we can make the necessary adjustments, have them retest, and overall keep the messaging of positive progress of a platform that is ultimately going to serve its end goals and keep users happy, and not getting the wrong message out to people by selecting carefully the right pilot group. And then tied into that is creating a proper feedback process, making sure that there is processes in place for during a UAT and pilots of these new platforms, of these new features that you're rolling out, that users can voice any displeasure, voice bugs, issues, or impacts, or even positive stuff, of course, to the right channels that it does get looked at by people. So there is a process to collect this information so it can be looked at and not fallen off the radar, which ultimately could potentially increase the risk of something blowing up as we go into production. So creating feedback processes is quite important. Now, as we talk about feedback and the importance of doing certain things and what happens when we don't, let's start talking about failure, because any change often is fraught with failure, and digital transformation certainly has its risks. So we're going to tie into Kevin here, and we'll chat a little bit about reasons for failure.
So especially when you think of like kind of building off of this too, and a lot of the reasons of failure are kind of following the opposites of some of what Michael and I have been covering. So like thinking of lack of engagement on the user community. So if forcing, oftentimes they were forcing technology down someone's throat. I think like one of the best examples I've heard of this is like a friend of mine. They were kind of working in like call center space. They kind of ended up getting a Zscaler kind of pushed on them to kind of change internet. They didn't talk to any of the end user community when they did this rollout. And effectively, when they rolled it out, it ended up breaking everybody's internet and access from their machines for like several days. So it ended up kind of creating a pretty broad impact. Versus, hey, let's go through this pilot. We're going to simplify how you access. Let's test it and have you use this and like let us know your feedback. So like having that user acceptance of a solution it can make a big difference. Like another good example too is a health insurance customer of mine. They were rolling out thin clients to their end user community. And they kind of just pushed it on them. They didn't say like, hey, this is why we're doing this. Like, this is the benefits to business. This is how it's going to improve your workflow. This is going to it's going to improve just our call center program within this organization. They pretty much just took people's devices, gave them a thin client, and said, all right, here you go. And they ended up getting pretty bad feedback during the pilot to the point where like they paused the rollout at this point. Hey, what's going on? What are we doing? We had to do pretty much an assessment of like what's going on. And we couldn't find anything in any of the data we were looking at from a Lakeside standpoint, Dynatrace, Citrix, like everything was performing well. Like what's going on? And interviewing some of the end users, a handful of them were like, I hate this. Like I don't know why I'm doing this. So we ended up kind of finding out that they were like self-sabotaging the pilot, and through the survey results, it was putting things on hold. So they ended up kind of the next round of the pilot kind of shifted it a little bit. Like let's focus on letting the team know like why we're doing this, like what's the value to them, what's the value to the business, and how it's going to make an impact, and how they can support and help drive that impact. And then they ended up kind of getting through all of these issues and avoiding them before. And that kind of builds off of like hesitancy to identify a champion. So rather than like setting up and like, hey, you're a up and comer, you're highly motivated, identifying like a champion within like a specific user community that can help influence the technology direction of them and their peers. It's a great opportunity as well to kind of find someone that's, highly motivated. Hey, they, up and comer, like this is an opportunity for you to maybe even like grow your career within your team because you're changing the business. Like, let's kind of use you for the work from home pilot. And you can be an advocate within your user community, kind of like one, share us feedback, but then also kind of encourage some of your peers to use the technology. So like not having these champions, it's definitely a missed opportunity in terms of career growth and development. You might have someone within your team or within, hey, marketing, I've always had a technical aptitude. Perfect. I'd love to kind of work through this work collaboration solution that we're using and how it improves my team. Like I can share it. I've been looking to pivot into this. Like, let me know how I can help. So there's that missed opportunity, but then you also lose the opportunity for advocates for future technology projects. Hey, you know what? This, John Smith in Department ABC was a great advocate for us, gave a ton of good feedback. We made a lot of big tweaks in terms of what could have been major issues when we rolled out. Like, let's work with John Smith again on the next, or Jane Doe on the next project of ours. And that kind of flows into like poor communication and onboarding documentation. I think one thing too, and I'm guilty of this is just as much as anybody, is like working in technology every day, you forget how often, like what it feels like not to understand technology. So for example, changing that printer icon, like Michael mentioned before, or suddenly like the color of the screen is different. Like, hey, is this broken? Like what changed? So like having that empathy when it comes to like giving something new to someone who might not understand to use it, how to use it, can go a long way. And this kind of goes back to like that one example I gave before when they rolled out, Zscaler and didn't really tell anybody how to troubleshoot it or what to expect. There was a ton of support tickets and something that could have definitely been avoided, especially when it comes to just communicating a little bit better in terms of, hey, this is what to expect. If you have issues, like follow this script. It's pretty much just here you go, change, and good luck, and sorry you can't work for a day. And that kind of flows into, the opposite of what I mentioned. A lot of it is just inability to effectively engage end users. And oftentimes this is a growing challenge too, especially as more like as a service is adopted. It's less about like infrastructure and more about how do we market this solution properly within the organization. A lot of teams are finding that, they have to put on almost like an internal sales hat for certain technology initiatives, especially if it's getting, started in a specific department. Okay, perfect. We need to use this more, like let's address this department. You almost gotta like sell that business leader in terms of like, hey, you should check this out. You should adopt this technology we just put together. I mean, I'm seeing this very often, very much in one of my manufacturing customers. We're starting with a specific division in Canada, and like selling, building out this, secure remote app solution for like SAP and things and otherwise. And like, hey, they're finding to continue to grow it, especially to fund the program since they do internal chargeback. They're gonna have to like sell it to other business units. So we've ended up putting together like end user training guides, like marketing slicks. Like they put together a landing page within SharePoint to kind of advertise the virtualized service that they're providing to the business to get more people to consume that technology. So that way they can continue to invest, continue to make a business impact within other businesses. And that kind of like flows into like that closed door mindset. Hey, you know what? Like we got to do this. This is my initiative. It doesn't matter how it affects anyone else. Like this is how we're doing it. We're not going to question prior assumptions, and we're not going to try to see if there's other stakeholders that may be able to impact this. And that can like really cascade into there's an issue and you can't find help. Or for example, you've made, that assumption that made sense for that technology, didn't make sense for this one. So now your cost controls are blown out of the water because you're giving everybody, a 4x32, desktop in the cloud and expecting it to be cost effective. And that kind of really gets into really the moving the goalposts, like, and why we kind of really highlighted having like a clear definition of success and who owns that success from the get-go can make a huge difference, because there's nothing that can derail a project more than adding new requirements midstream, or like having someone come in that has no awareness of the project and saying like, wait a second, you can't change this, like you have to do this way. Why didn't you come to me earlier? And so then next thing I've seen, Michael and I saw a whole work from home initiative collapse just because of that last bullet. So yeah, those are some of the main things, Michael. And kind of building off of that, is there any other steps to success you'd like to share?
Yeah,
or like
absolutely.
any other commentary on failure?
Yeah, so the collaboration is a big one, and you just hit the nail on the head where, again, it's very important, not only just as you mentioned, there was the stakeholders there, and security coming in too late in the game to say, hey, great, why didn't you engage me, or this and that. The other challenge that we've seen with these types of things that have led to failure is when again, we're told that, let's say, security's at the table, but they're being we're not getting them directly at the table. They're being gate kept by someone else, or we'll have situations where someone out of the gate during the discovery process says, well, here's a constraint. This is the endpoint, and here's what we're doing with security on the endpoint, and this is what you have to adhere to. So suddenly you're doing a bunch of Cirque du Soleil contortion with your technology configurations, and is wasting a lot of time trying to get something working that may actually be very bleeding edge and unique, that hasn't been really tested before, mixing certain sets of technologies and security controls in an endpoint and spinning your tires, which then starts bleeding into the endpoint design changing 5 times and the goalposts being moved. So it is very important. I want to emphasize this, that as part of the initial planning and discovery phase, focus more on the higher level outcomes for, let's say, security. Our endpoint has to meet these things. Zero trust. It needs to have X, Y, Z, whatever the case is, from a higher level, and not so much on here's how we're doing that. We're going to use we're using a Linux-based thin client or a Windows 10 kiosk mode, and we're going to have these specific controls in place, certificate authentication for this reason. Take a step back, look at the requirements that we have to meet, and then worry about the how, so that you can group together and find out what security controls, as an example, we can bring into the picture to mitigate the given risks or things that we need to obtain, and not being so rigid up front. It's important to get more rigid as the program continues, otherwise everything will be changing and the goalposts will be changing on a number of fronts as we go. So it is important, as things start crystallizing, the project moves forward, to start being more rigid. But at the outset, if you're not doing that, you can end up spending a lot of time, wasting a lot of time trying to figure out ways to get things to work, or you're doing it during the deploy phase and finding out then these hard constraints just aren't viable. So moving over to John Cotter's model here. So John Cotter is he's a Harvard professor, and in the 90s he developed this 8 steps to success for change models, and this has become relied on heavily from folks engaging in any kind of organizational change. It's very business centric, and then it trickles down. But I do recommend looking up John Cotter's work on this to understand a bit more how this plan will help mitigate a lot of the missteps that organizations make when they're trying to roll out massive change, even minor change within an organization, and looking to get buy-in and improve the success rate of major change within an organization. And this is whether it's business centric, whether it's IT centric, whatever the case is. But if you start and move through the change phase for digital workspace transformation through there, you're more likely to gain the consensus that you need, the coalition that you need, the buy-in that you need, and improve the success by having all these plans done ahead of time and these checks and balances in place by following plans like this. So I do recommend, for those that have not reviewed this before, to look up Cotter's 8-step model to find out a little bit more about it, because I do feel this is one of the more relevant tools to digital transformation today, as far as planning a program that affects large change within an organization. And with that, I think we should start summarizing what we've talked about here so far in this presentation. So we'll start off with a couple of do's and don'ts. So do engage the end user. What's important here in these things is understanding that digital workspace transformation affects the user and how they work more than any other factor. Yes, it impacts infrastructure, security, all these other great things, but it impacts the user most of all. So it's important to engage the user earlier on. Do not rely on assumptions on how the user works, their work styles, how they use the platform today, and what have you. It's important to run those interviews and understand how they actually truly working, and working backwards from there. Next up, enlisting the champions of business units, which they can then be your champions to promote the change in the organization. And also, so these often power users will help give you the core information you need to understand how folks in their business units need to work. Do not believe that everyone's going to be good with whatever generic offering you provide them and they must adhere to that, although in some circumstances that might fly. when we're dealing with a significant change to their workspace transition, that can set you up for a world of pain as you work through rolling this out and trying to get buy-in and putting out all sorts of fires across lines of businesses who aren't happy with their user environments being rolled out. Next up, do identify a clear plan. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And so it's important to start off and spend a good portion of time through a program like this, identifying what the plan is, what the goals are, what the drivers are, and work from there. And do not try and treat this as an ad hoc mentality. This type of transition is one of these things that requires a proper task force, requires involvement from a number of different teams across the organization, endpoint security, infrastructure, business, application folks, what have you. And it's important to make sure that this is an ongoing process with good cadence, and it's not treated ad hoc where it becomes a lower priority. That's when you start going to run into pain, because it is a significant change. You don't build an office building ad hoc. There's a full plan that goes into that to make sure that it's successful and executed properly. Next up, set clear and attainable timelines. Don't just throw a plan together and say, yeah, we're just going to roll it out and do it. Want to make sure that we identify clear milestones that are attainable, be realistic with the timelines. So it's important that based on the nature of the business, how complicated it is and how complicated the change is and how large the company is, to set clear and attainable timelines. And this is going to help everyone understand a bit better the success criteria and allow people to get things done properly the first time around. Next up, set clear and attainable goals. Don't just hope for the best as you're going through your milestone creation and whatnot. And next, last up, make sure that we create a feedback loop. Do not make sure the feedback processes exist throughout the UAT and the pilot phases of these types of transformations, and do not have a closed mindset about this, right? Users feel that, especially with projects like this. If they feel that they're not being listened to and what you're rolling out is a hindrance to serve specific business needs and not without truly understanding them, that's a problem. And again, if you plan to fail, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So with that, going to roll in to Kevin here to give us some key takeaways, and I think we can close out.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you, Michael. And yeah, a lot of these things, I think, if it really comes down to communication, right? Working with your colleagues, like, I mean, the one thing with transformation and technology is a human impact, right? I know we've talked through a lot of examples around establishing work from home, allowing people to work better, like helping people meet their KPIs as like an end user or even like as an IT champion. It really comes down to communication. Like, what are your peers motivated by? How are they being compensated? How are they being measured? What are the end users who you're driving technology change, which can either increase the quality of their work-life balance, like help them perform better at their job, you'd be able to spend more time with their family. You know, hybrid work is pretty amazing, especially when it comes to just being able to work shift, work slice, and increase your quality of life. So if you had to kind of really think of anything outside of the key takeaways on the screen, is like transformation and technology, there is a human impact. So like having that empathy, having that consideration as you go through these projects of not how it just impacts your team, but like how can you potentially work with other teams where there may be a dependency? What's your motivations? How can we work best together? What are your timelines, as well as the communities that you're working with when it comes to rolling out that technology? Is this something you understand? Like, have you seen this before? How can we make sure and communicate with you through multiple paths, not just like tickets, for example, but like, let's set up like a end user lunch and learn. Let's have a Teams channel or Slack channel specifically for this, Work Smarter initiative, or however it's dubbed internally, so we can get that feedback and we can get that pain. So, I mean, if you had to, like I said, summarize all this, in just like kind of one word, it really would be communication makes and breaks the transformation. So going through that discovery, learning from your peers, putting together a proper plan, and getting vested stake in that plan really is like one of the key foundational items of driving a transformation successfully.
You guys did an amazing job. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So much great information, and really appreciate your passion and your energy into this subject. You are definitely subject matter experts. I think that's it. In close, I wanted to thank the audience for joining us today. Really appreciate your time and taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. As Todd mentioned, we will be posting this webinar and all of our others on our YouTube channel. So be sure to follow us on social media, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, etc. We are definitely there and would love to connect with you. So please feel free to reach out. Thank you again, gentlemen. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you as well.